You hold the power to change your life, and it's really so simple. Use your head, lose your ass. Who wants to lose their ass? If you clicked on this video, you probably already know what I'm going to be talking about. This book, Skinny Bitch, which is a book that had a pretty significant impact on my life. You may have heard of it, you may have even read it, or maybe you never heard of it at all. It is a book about veganism that came out in 2005. It was a #1 New York Times bestseller. It was a pretty big part of pop culture at the time. It went on to have a bunch of follow-up books, Skinny Bitch in the Kitsch, Skinny Bastard, Skinny Bitch Bun in the Oven, and I think there were even a few more, but those are the ones that I can remember. The women who wrote this book were Rory Friedman and Kim Barnuen. For Rory Friedman, it says she is a former agent for Ford Models and a self-taught know-it-all. For Kim, it says she's a former model who holds a Master's of Science degree in holistic nutrition, which I think is an interesting point because a lot of the nutrition stuff in the book is pretty spot on, but we will get into that. So I read this book 13 years ago and it inspired me to go vegan. So if you're thinking, wow, you've been vegan for 13 years? Actually, no. And I want to sort of talk about this and sort of get this out of the way at the beginning, just kind of a disclaimer, I guess. I was vegetarian for a year before I read this book. I read it, it inspired me to go vegan. I was then vegan for the next 3 years until I graduated college, and then I made the decision to go back to being vegetarian and start eating eggs and dairy again. I was vegetarian again for about 5 years, and then about 3.5 years ago, I made the switch back to veganism, this time for life. I will never not be vegan. Back then, in 2007, when I read this and went vegan, that's what we would have called it. Like, I said that I was vegan, everyone else thought of me as vegan. That was really the only term at the time for what I was doing. Nowadays, looking back, I think that what I was might fall more into the category or label of plant-based. However, at that time, the term plant-based did not exist. So basically I followed a vegan diet, but I don't think I was as fully committed to the lifestyle as I am now. I just don't really feel like it's right to call what I was back then vegan. I would say now that it was plant-based. But for the sake of this video, I probably will refer to it as veganism and you guys will know what I mean. Basically, I'm gonna go over sort of my history with the book, when I read it, where I was at in my life at the time, how it affected me. And then I want to go through chapter by chapter and sort of go a little bit into my thoughts on each chapter, reading it now versus then, if I agree or disagree with the information and the way that it's presented. And then at the end, I'll go over my positive and negative takeaways from the book from my perspective now. And if you don't know, this is a book about veganism, but it is shrouded in this kind of like super crass, kind of like tough love language that I think if you struggle with like body image issues or anything along those lines, the language can be a little bit triggering. So I just wanted to say that now, that if you are kind of easily triggered by diet culture type of language and like fat shaming, proceed with caution because there is a lot of that in this book. I've gone through a lot in my life since I read this book. I went vegan, I stopped being vegan, I graduated college, I lived in LA for 7 years, I went back to being vegan again. I just recently, very recently finished my plant-based nutrition course through eCornell, so I feel like I have a lot more knowledge on nutrition now and a lot more perspective now than I did then. Everything that I've been through just gave me a different insight on the book reading it now versus when I was 18 and like didn't really know anything and was much more impressionable. So I want to take you back to summer 2007. I had just finished my freshman year of college. I had gone vegetarian my freshman year. I had actually gained a little bit of weight toward the very end of my freshman year of college. Probably somewhere around 10 pounds, maybe a little less, but the point was that I was feeling pretty uncomfortable in my body at the time, and it was the summer, and so I felt just much more self-conscious than usual, and I was just in kind of an uncomfortable headspace about it. One night that summer, I am sitting there watching E! News. This was in like the heyday of E! News with like Juliana Rancic, Ryan Seacrest. So I'm sitting there watching and Juliana goes something like, "Coming up, the book that all the celebs are reading to get skinny." And I'm not gonna lie, I perked up. I was interested. Finally, it got to the segment, and it turned out that the book was Skinny Bitch. I guess a lot of celebs were seen carrying this around like in their paparazzi photos, and I remember one of them was Victoria Beckham. Like that was one of the biggest ones that everyone was like, oh my gosh, like Victoria Beckham's reading this book. So anyway, they had a whole segment on this book, which looking back is kind of crazy that on like a major platform like E, that they featured a book about veganism for like an entire segment of a show. I had heard of a vegan diet before, being vegetarian, but I don't think I had ever met anyone that was a vegan. If I had ever thought of it, it was always in the terms of like, that's so extreme and crazy, I could never do that. This was also in the early days of Amazon, where I think like they really only sold books. They used to have a feature, I'm not even sure if they still do this, where it was like see inside. And so I read the first couple chapters, or you know, maybe even it was just the first like 5 to 10 pages, but it like really drew me in and I was hooked. And so I ordered the book on Amazon and I read it, and I immediately decided that I wanted to become vegan. I was like, anyone who read that, like no one could read this book and not go vegan, because the arguments they make are so compelling and like, oh my God, like I want my family to read this book. So I convinced my mom, my dad, my brother all to read this. So they all read it and none of them went vegan. That's just how compelled I was by the book, that I thought that like it was so influential on me, at least, that I thought it would be as influential on everyone else. Which I think it was on a lot of people, just not on my family. My sort of main memory of like the thesis of the book was, you can eat whatever you want as long as it's vegan and you will be skinny. That was what I remember the book saying. That was sort of like my takeaway. And so although I switched to a vegan diet, it was not a healthy vegan diet. I ate a lot of junk food. I ate a lot of crap. There wasn't really an emphasis on like whole foods. I don't remember supplementing with B12. Like, I don't think I did. I wasn't super careful about getting like vitamin D and eating like a variety of foods where I would have gotten all my essential nutrients. Over the course of the 3 years that I was vegan the first time around, I actually gained a lot of weight. So I would say I gained an additional maybe 10 pounds from even where I was at when I started. So by the time I graduated college, I was the heaviest I ever was, and I also didn't feel very healthy at all. Like I remember always feeling at that time like, this isn't sustainable, this is not gonna last forever. A vegan diet obviously isn't healthy for our bodies, like the book was wrong, and sort of like talked myself out of it, which looking back, I think I was clearly just deficient in a lot of things. Although this book kickstarted my journey of veganism, it came to an end and it wasn't a sustainable or lasting change. Basing your decision to go vegan from like a vanity perspective, I think it, you know, maybe can be sustainable, but I think it's a lot harder to sustain it with just that goal in mind, because it's like, if you don't reach that goal, then what other motivation do you have to stay vegan? So there's a little overview of the impact that the book had on me and the outcome that that impact had. So now I want to go through the chapters and talk about my impression of each chapter as I reread it. Also, when I gave this book to my mom to read, unbeknownst to me, she was taking notes in the margins in pen. And I was like, you don't understand, this book is like my Bible. Like, it's the only source of information that I have, and you're writing in it in pen, even though it really pissed me off and like still kind of does. Some of the notes are funny and I will share them as we go along. I'll just start with a little quote from the intro and we can immediately start discussing the problematic nature of this book. Are you sick and tired of being fat? Good. If you can't take one more day of self-loathing, you're ready to get skinny. That's the opening line of the book. We were in a very different place in terms of the body positivity and body acceptance movements. Obviously, the main problem is that they're equating being fat with bad and being skinny with good, and that if you're fat, you should be in a place of self-loathing. And you know, it's really just kind of toxic. And like, reading that as an 18-year-old, like my brain was still developing and my thoughts were still forming, and so like, how could I not be like influenced by that kind of language at the time? This is not a diet, this is a way of life, a way to enjoy food. By the way, I feel like every single diet book is always like, this isn't a diet book. This isn't like the other diet books. We're an anti-diet book. But like they all say that, but like they're all kind of like diet books. Although I agree with the fact that like veganism isn't a diet, it's a lifestyle, but the way that they're putting the emphasis on like weight loss and being skinny, that does kind of read like a diet book. I'll just say this now, this book was clearly catered to a certain demographic, and that demographic was female, white, and privileged. Hello? When I was rereading it, I kept thinking that what if every time they said the word skinny, it was replaced with the word healthy? And I think the book would read a lot better that way, because it's not so much focused on the appearance, but rather on how something feels on the inside. All right, well, I'll just get into chapter 1 because this is gonna make the point that I was just about to make. Chapter 1 is called Give It Up. Here's how it starts. Okay, use your head. You need to get healthy if you want to get skinny. Healthy equals skinny. Unhealthy equals fat. That is just so untrue that like if you're skinny, you're automatically healthy. Like heroin addicts are skinny. Like that, like skinny does not equal healthy. And fat does not equal unhealthy. You can be healthy at a higher weight, you can be unhealthy at a lower weight. So they're talking about how you should give up smoking, binge drinking, you know, all the foods that you are gonna need to give up. Another really difficult part to read. Of course, it's easier to socialize after you've had a few drinks, but being a fat pig will hinder you sober or drunk. First of all, let's not like throw a negative light on pigs. Pigs are off limits here. Implying that no one will want to talk to you, whether you're sober or drunk, if you're fat, is so wrong and such a misguided statement. And so damaging. Like, can you imagine reading this book if you were overweight and just like thinking like, oh yeah, no one wants to talk to me because I'm fat. Like, that is just like shocking. And I mean, to say it doesn't age well is like an complete understatement. Even if it's in the name of like no nonsense tough love, it's just not true. And, you know, could be potentially really damaging. So they go really hard against soda. They say soda is liquid Satan. They also go really hard against caffeine and like basically say that like you shouldn't drink coffee at all, and like having a cup of green tea is fine, but like if you need coffee to get you going in the morning, like then that's pathetic. And I really don't agree with that. Like maybe I just like really don't want to give up my morning cappuccino, but like, you know, everything that I've learned since then is basically that there's like nothing really wrong with like having a few cups of coffee or a coffee drink as long as you're not like overdoing it. I think caffeine in moderation is totally fine. They also talk about junk food and like the junk food industry. They talk about medicine and like the pharmaceutical industry, and they talk about exercise and why exercise is important. Honestly, everything else they said in this chapter was pretty reasonable to me. So next we have chapter 2, which is called Carbs, the Truth. And this is all about the low carb phenomenon. I think this information is really great, basically saying complex carbohydrates are much better than simple carbohydrates, but all carbs get vilified the same for some reason, and we shouldn't be afraid of carbohydrates, just we should avoid simple carbohydrates. So basically they're just debunking the low carb craze in this section. There's one sentence that says, the most irritating thing about the low carb craze is the resistance to eating fruit. My mom wrote, this I agree with. So at least we can agree on something. All right, chapter 3 is called Sugar is the Devil. And honestly, this title of this chapter has just stuck in my head so much over the years. Not that I like vilify sugar or never eat it, but like just that stance of being like sugar is the devil, it is like such a hard stance to take. And chapter starts with, we all know how difficult it is to stay away from sugar, but if you don't exercise this demon from your diet, you will never be a skinny bitch. And my mom wrote, bullshit. It's ridiculous to say that if you eat sugar at all, you will never be skinny. I think it can be eaten in moderation, but I get it. They're talking about like refined sugar and how sugary foods are more addicting to our brains. And they also say, you know, refined sugar has no nutritional value, and it's usually in foods that contain gobs of fat, lots of useless calories, and loads of cholesterol. So you become addicted to foods because they contain sugar that have a large amount of fat, saturated fat, hydrogenated oils, and calories. I totally agree with that. They also talk about high fructose corn syrup and how pervasive it is. And then they go into a little bit of like the history of aspartame, which is really interesting. Namely, when aspartame was put before the FDA for approval for the first time, it was denied 8 times because it was thought to be so unsafe. And then it finally got approved, but in like a really kind of like corrupt way. And that's kind of scary. And that's, I think, a pretty good reason to stay away from aspartame. Okay, moving on to the next chapter. Chapter 4 is called The Dead, Rotting, Decomposing Flesh Diet, and this chapter is mostly about the Atkins diet. That kind of dates the book, right? Like 2005, the Atkins diet was really big, and so they're sort of like debunking it. You could almost just like replace the Atkins diet in this chapter with like the keto diet or the paleo diet, and or the carnivore diet. And it's basically the exact same thing. It's crazy how like the Atkins diet has died out, but it has been replaced by like multiple other diets that are arguably even more insane than the Atkins diet because they place even more of an emphasis on animal foods and even less of an emphasis on plant foods than even the Atkins diet did. There was a quote that I really liked in this chapter. They say, yes, humans have a high level of intelligence. Yes, we created weapons for hunting and fire for cooking. Yes, we found a way to mass produce animals for consumption. However, if you study animals in the wild, you will note that they do not rely on anything other than their natural hunting ability, speed, strength, claws, teeth, and jaws. They have no tools or weapons. Now look at yourself. Look at your flimsy fingernails in comparison to an eagle's talons. Look at your flat, blunt teeth compared to a lion's fangs. Compare your speed and agility to that of a tiger. Compare the strength of your jaw to a wolf's. Imagine yourself trying to run after an animal, catch it, and kill it using your bare hands, fingernails, teeth, and jaws. Not only would you look ridiculous, but you'd probably get your ass kicked too. And even if you were successful, envision yourself eating the kill without the aid of an oven and silverware. Yes, the human brain allows us to stay removed from the process of hunting. But does this mean we are evolved and intelligent and should be eating animal flesh just because we can? Man's intelligence also created alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs. Should we drink, smoke, and use just because we can? I just found that to be a very compelling passage, especially the part of like, just because we have the ability to mass produce and kill and eat animals, like, does it mean that we should if we don't need to? No. They talk about the meat production industry and how horrible it is. They talk about antibiotic use in animals and how that can contribute to antibiotic resistance in humans. And then they go over all of the negative health effects of eating meat. So much of the stuff that they talk about of like the science of what happens to our bodies when we eat meat, I feel like has been corroborated for me through like all the research I've done since then. My entire plant-based nutrition program, everything I've learned about nutrition since then, I completely agree with everything that they say about the negative side effects of eating meat. Then there's a part that is another cringy part. It starts out really great and then it gets cringe. So before you say I could never give up meat, realize that nearly every single vegetarian on the planet said those same words. True. Then shut the fuck up, look at an inspirational picture of a skinny bitch and clean out your freezer. It's just so warped the way that they keep conflating veganism with skinniness. It's crazy. All right, chapter 5 is called The Dairy Disaster, and here we get into the good old dairy industry. I found this chapter to be really well written, compelling, completely agree with everything that they say about the dairy industry, as well as like the lies around dairy's positive nutritional attributes and how it can actually have very negative effects on our bodies. The first line of this dairy disaster is very attention grabbing. Go suck your mother's tits. Go on, suck your mother's tits. You think this is ridiculous? It is. Get ready to use your head. Just another great old skinny bitch zinger. This was an interesting part where they talk about how it is kind of well known that dairy is bad for you. They say, yes, we are saying it is common knowledge in the medical research field that dairy is bad for you. Yes, we are saying that executives in the dairy industry are well aware of this fact, but make claims that milk does a body good. How do they get away with it? Easily. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars every year to market their products. And average consumers don't spend their time perusing medical journals, but they do read magazines and watch television. This is literally why most people think that they need to eat dairy and meat, and why they think that dairy and meat don't have adverse health effects, because the dairy and meat industries are two of the most powerful industries in the world, especially in the US, and they spend the money in super insidious ways that you would literally never even think, like, oh, this is actually an ad for the dairy industry and I am being advertised to right now. Like, we are all suckers for the dairy and meat industries. And I don't just mean sucking on your mother's teeth. There is a quote that I wrote, made me emo. I'm not sure if I should read it because that might be too hard to read. Okay, this makes me so emo because, okay, at the end of the chapter, the last paragraph is, as the demand grows for healthy, yummy, animal-free, dairy-free products, more companies will supply us with these foods. So let your consumer dollars voice your desire, and your body will be rewarded. This book was written 15 years ago, and just like look at what has happened specifically in the last 2 years with the dairy alternatives, and like everyone's obsessed with oat milk. So it just made me emotional reading those words, that it's like, if the demand keeps up, like this is what will happen. And then it's like, oh my God, they're right. Like that's what happened. Like it's happening. Something to feel good about. Chapter 6 is called You Are What You Eat. And speaking of emo, ooh, this chapter, this is by far the hardest chapter in the book to read. I actually was like flying through, like reading this all in one day. And then after I read this chapter, I took like 2 weeks off from reading this because it just was really, really heavy. I read an interview with one of the authors like years later, and she basically was like, we wanted to write an animal rights book, but we wanted it to be like highly marketable, which is why we sort of surrounded it in all the like skinny bitch kind of stuff. But like at the heart of it, like I wanted to write a book about animal rights, and this chapter is sort of like the punch, like the heart of that animal rights message. Mainly it talks about slaughterhouse practices and factory farm conditions. I won't read any of the super disturbing quotes, but basically they heavily quoted this book called Slaughterhouse, in which this woman spent, I think, a year going around and interviewing people that work in slaughterhouses, as well as like USDA inspectors that spent a lot of time in slaughterhouses. And she interviewed them on what they saw, what they did, all of the horrors of slaughterhouses, and people just didn't hold back and they told her everything. And they put a bunch of quotes from that book in here. It is just like, it's beyond horrifying. It was so hard to read. But I will say, if you are someone who eats meat and you do kind of, or you are curious about what goes on in the meat industry, and you do sort of want to like educate yourself, but you're like scared to watch a video, like a PETA video, and like you don't want to see, I think reading about it is a little bit easier than seeing the images, and it gives you the information without having to like subject your brain to the images. And so I do think reading about it can be just as effective in terms of like motivating you to change. So if you want to go ahead and read chapter 6 of Skinny Bitch, you know, I'm sure you can take it out from your library. But I did want to read one passage. It's not a overly graphic passage, but it does, I think, just kind of like hit the nail on the head. God, I always get like 10 times more emotional than I think I'm going to get. Okay. Think of how you feel when you are angry, afraid, and grief-stricken. Bear in mind the physical feelings that accompany these emotions. These emotions, fear, grief, and rage, produce chemical changes in our bodies. They do the same to the animals. Their blood pressures rise, adrenaline courses through their bodies. You are eating high blood pressure, stress, and adrenaline. You are eating fear, grief, and rage. You are eating suffering, horror, and murder. You are eating cruelty. You are what you eat. The whole thing about like you are consuming the animal's fear and their pain, that is something that like I hear echoed a lot in the animal rights movement, and especially from people that have read this book. I think that's something that like really sticks with them, like that you are consuming that. And I don't know how much of a physical impact that has on the meat and like what impact that has on your body. Like I can't really say that with certainty, but I think of it as more of this like karmic effect of like, you're eating this, you're consuming others' suffering, that I think is just like a karmic loop that I like wanted to get out of. Just think of how that affects you, like every time you eat, having to think like, oh God, I can't think about what I'm eating, otherwise it'll upset me too much. Like I used to be like that. Think about what that does to you mentally, that you're constantly living in this place of like denial and like denied guilt. And then like imagine the opposite of that, where you just no longer have to like think about that. It brings so much joy and peace. This is another quote that's pretty staggering, and it was the first time I read it was in here, and it seems insane reading it, but like it says so much about like the world we live in and our priorities, and like how crazy really humans are for the way that we choose to produce our food. Moreover, the amount of land, food, water, and energy used to raise 10 billion animals a year for slaughter could be used to grow food for all the starving people in the world. So we just have this massive disparity of like people dying of starvation in third world countries, and on the opposite end of the spectrum, Americans dying from diseases that they have eaten their way into oftentimes. We just have this massive overconsumption tendency in the US, and like not only are the foods we eating making us sick, but the resources required in order to raise that food are so disproportionately high and could be diverted to other parts of the world that need that food more. So now let's move on to chapter 7, which is the myths and lies about protein. It is one of the most pervasive misconceptions, and it is really damaging because I think thinking that is what stops so many people from going vegan, right? The like, how do you get your protein is sort of like the number one kind of most common like, I wrote like, shit people say to vegans. If someone were to die of a protein deficiency, it's most likely because they were consuming far too few calories overall, and they died of more of like starvation related issues. We certainly don't have a protein underconsumption problem. If anything, we have a protein overconsumption problem, and overconsumption of protein can lead to a lot more problems. We need protein in order to survive. We just don't need as much of it as most people think, and it is very easy to get all the protein you need on a vegan diet. They talk about the essential amino acids. There's basically 9 amino acids that our bodies can't produce, that we have to get from food. All of these 9 essential amino acids are present in some form in plant foods, and all we have to do is eat a variety of plant foods. And it's not even like a wide variety. If you eat like rice and beans, you've got all your essential amino acids within those 2 things. You don't even have to eat them together. Just like if you eat rice at some point in the day, or like a whole grain, and then if you eat a legume at some other point in the day, you've got your 9 essential amino acids. Chapter 8 is called pooping. Basically, this chapter is mostly about fiber and how when you eat more fiber, you will have healthier bowel movements, and how fiber is super important, and without it you can be constipated, and pooping is obviously good for your health. It's how we detoxify our bodies. There's this part of this chapter that definitely had an impact on me at the time. I have thought this to be true, and I actually don't think it's true anymore. It's basically like a food combining type of thing, where they say that you should always eat fruit by itself. What they say is that fruit is super simple for your body to digest, so when you eat it with something that's more complex for your body to digest, your body kind of like puts aside the fruit, and then the fruit can kind of like rot in your intestinal tract. I don't know, I believed this right away because I felt like I had experienced it. Like I remember in college, I would like eat lunch, and then like instead of having, you know, dessert or whatever, I would just like grab an apple and eat an apple. And when I would eat the apple after I had eaten my meal, after I ate the apple, I felt like 10 times more full, bloated, and I always was confused by that. And then I read this and I was like, oh my God, like that's why. But I think that is pretty unfounded based on what I've learned since then. Okay, chapter 9 is called Have No Faith, Governmental Agencies Don't Give a Shit About Your Health. It's basically about corruption within the government, the USDA, the FDA, the EPA, and it's pretty scary, some of the stuff that they go into. There was a whole part of my plant-based nutrition course about lobbying, and it actually ended up being one of my most favorite parts of the course. There's this revolving door phenomenon, which I didn't know much about lobbying or politics, so I hadn't heard about that before. A lot of you probably know what that is, but it's basically when people from big corporations like the meat and dairy industries will then start working in government and you know, be appointed to high government positions and, you know, make changes to benefit their industry. And then similarly, people that are working in government will then go work for the meat and dairy industries. And so it's just this like cycle of corruption. And on top of that, the meat and dairy industries will make like massive campaign contributions to political figures and in turn get their interests met, you know, prioritized above the safety of the public oftentimes. And they also talk about the food pyramid, which is like a big controversial thing that meat and dairy has always kind of been prioritized in the food pyramid. And there's been a lot of different iterations of this. There was a whole part about this in my course as well. But basically, I think in 2015 the food pyramid was changed to like deprioritize animal products and more highly prioritize plant foods. And the meat and dairy lobbies were able to get it switched back to reprioritize meat and dairy products. So that's just the pyramid. It's like a whole pyramid scheme. You know, we're supposed to be like looking to that for optimal health, and it's just basically like these organizations are just like buying their spot in the food pyramid, and they have way more money than like the lentil industry or, you know, the plant foods industries. This was interesting with relation to what's going on right now. The USDA will spend $30 million a year on beef bailouts alone. Another $30 million of our hard-earned money goes toward pork purchases. Yes, the USDA bailouts are insane. The dairy industry gets a ton of them. I think last year it was like there was an article that was like there is a like 1 billion pound cheese stockpile that like the government is like refrigerating with our tax dollars. So basically the government buys up cheese products that don't sell, and because the dairy industry has been going down and down and down, less and less dairy products are selling, the government will buy up those products and keep them refrigerated until they can figure out like what to do with them, aka usually like pawning them off on like schools, hospitals, jails, trying to push them out into the public somehow. And so it's crazy that like our tax dollars like fund these industries to get bailed out when they need to be bailed out because like we are, as a general public, spending less and less money on these types of foods, and yet our money is still going to them through our taxes. So that's crazy. Yeah, the bottom line of this chapter was that government agencies are not always looking out for public interest when it comes to our health with regards to meat and dairy, and politicians are oftentimes bought by these industries. Just like they're bought with a lot of big industries. Like we hear about that a lot, but it happens with food too. Chapter 10 is called Don't Be a Pussy, LOL. First few sentences, again, very problematic. What if someone told you that you could totally change your life and have the body you want for the rest of your life? What if all you had to do was follow a simple formula and maybe struggle for a month or two? What if you could reprogram your brain to actually enjoy healthy foods? Well, guess what? You can change your life. You can have the body you want for the rest of your life. You can enjoy healthy foods. All you have to do is follow a simple formula and be willing to delay gratification for a few months. This literally sounds like the pitch of like an MLM or like a pyramid scheme. Like, what if I told you you could have the body? It's like, what? Like, you could have the body you want for the rest of your life. Let me just tell you from personal experience, no, that's not necessarily true. There are so many factors that go into having the body you want. It's how healthy of a diet you eat. It's how much you exercise. It's your genetics. It's your lifestyle. It's so much that goes into that. Basically in this chapter, they're giving you advice on how to best make the transition to a plant-based diet, some helpful stuff. Here's a part that I really wanted to talk about. Enough of all this melodrama. It's not like you're gonna be hungry and cranky for all of eternity. We know that dieters always crash when their favorite foods become forbidden. So we devised the Skinny Bitch plan to allow for cookies, cakes, chocolate, burgers, ice cream, etc. They just aren't the same ones you're used to. You're not giving up anything. You're just trading in all your old gross food. Big deal. The new stuff is just as good, so don't kid yourself with this old, I had a craving routine. Okay, this was probably the part of the book that was most damaging to my mindset at the time. And this is the part of the book that validates what I sort of remember my main takeaway being, which was that you could still eat like vegan junk food and like totally be like a skinny bitch or whatever. To transition, I relied a lot on like processed vegan junk foods, and I never really got away from that habit. Like I never really focused on like whole plant foods. Like I always kind of focused on processed foods. And according to Skinny Bitch, like I thought that that was totally fine. But if you're eating a lot of calories, if you're eating a lot of fat and sugar, you are still going to gain weight. They say the only thing more annoying than the where do you get your protein question is the my body is craving meat, I must need iron comment. Most cravings are not reliable indicators of what your body needs. So I disagree that like a craving doesn't mean anything, but I do agree that it doesn't necessarily mean that like if you're craving a steak, you need a steak. Like maybe you just need some lentils or some beans or some greens. You know, maybe you just need iron or protein. They talk about how cheese can be chemically addicting, and I completely agree with this. Milk contains casein, which is a milk protein. It breaks down in our bodies into casomorphine, and it attaches to pleasure receptors in our brain, the same pleasure receptors that opiates would attach to. And it's a much smaller dose. It's not like taking a hit of heroin every time you eat cheese, but it does produce that like pleasure feeling in your brain, and therefore an addiction type of response or craving for it. Even though I had read it in this book, when I started eating dairy again, I conveniently forgot all about this. And it wasn't until I think 2015 that I read an article, and I'll try to find the article and put it on the screen, but it was about how like we can actually become addicted to cheese. And reading that article just like really empowered me, because I was like, oh, wait a minute. I think that I could never give up cheese again, but I actually could. I just think I couldn't because my brain is addicted to it. Basically, cow's milk and human milk contain these compounds to make the infant like addicted to the milk and want more and more of it as a natural way to help the baby grow in a healthy way. But once we're weaned from the teat, you know, it's obviously abnormal for us to start drinking another species' milk, which is what happens to us as humans pretty much right when we're weaned from the teat. We start drinking milk and eating milk products, so those can have the same kind of chemical effects on our brain. But unfortunately, it's also coupled with all of the negative health effects of eating cheese, and also like environmental, ethical downsides. Liquid milk has it, but in less of a concentrated version than cheese does. So that's why cheese is sort of like the worst offender of the like addiction thing. Here is something, speaking of the like, you can eat as much as you want as long as it's vegan thing, here is like a really good example of that. Even if you do have some serious PMS cravings, the good thing about the Skinny Bitch regimen is that there are plenty of naughty tasting foods that you don't need to feel bad about. So eat all day long. As long as everything you put in your mouth meets Skinny Bitch approval, it's fine. They say just be sure that when you're full, you stop eating. You know, I think when you're eating like higher sugar foods, like I was, and like they're saying that is totally fine too, as long as they like meet Skinny Bitch approval, it is harder to stop when you're full. And I think I like messed up the chemistry in my brain that like told me when I was full for a while, and I had to like relearn it. And now I feel like I have no problem with that at all. So that passage is very deceptive. Then they go on to talk about fasting and like saying how it's like really good for your body, and like fasts can last anywhere from 24 hours to 10 days or more. It's all up to you and how light, clean, and healthy you want to get. The longer the better, but even just one day at a time, one time a month is beneficial. Oof, it's up to you how light, clean, and healthy you want to get. The longer the better. Everything that I've learned since then is that fasts are not actually beneficial. Eating whole, clean, unprocessed foods as often as you can is going to be more than your body needs to detoxify. You do not need to fast. I know that it is common in certain like religions and cultures, and I do not want to like negate that or say that that's wrong, but them encouraging people to kind of like starve themselves for days at a time just big yikes to me. Then they talk about vitamins. They recommend getting most of your vitamins from food or sunlight, in the case of D3, with the exception of B12, which you do have to supplement for. I completely agree with this whole part. Chapter 11 is called Let's Eat. They're kind of recommendations for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I really disagree with a lot of what they say. One thing I do agree with is that you should wait to eat breakfast in the morning until you're actually hungry. But then they say that like your breakfast should be just like a piece of fruit. When you do eat, the breakfast of skinny bitches is organic fruit. This may seem light in comparison to your previous bagel or eggs or cereal, but once you adapt, you will be totally fulfilled by fruit. Eat one piece or serving slowly. After a period of time, perhaps 10 minutes or so, when you feel hungry, eat another piece slowly. When you feel hungry again, eat one more. Breakfast is over. Are you fucking kidding me? Okay, first of all, most vegan like nutritionists and doctors, like pretty much across the board, everyone recommends oatmeal. So like, I personally don't really like oatmeal, but like even that would have been better in here than like a piece of fruit. No, I think you should have a healthy, nourishing, satisfying breakfast that's going to keep you full and energized until you're ready to eat. Again, whether it's your snack or your lunch. But then they're like, but if you are having a hard time with that after 2 weeks, here are some approved breakfast foods that you can eat. And like all the breakfast foods they recommend are like highly processed foods. So I'm like, so you're recommending either a piece of fruit or these like super processed packaged foods, which are the complete opposite end of the spectrum. No in between. That just seemed really off to me. The lunch and dinner recommendations that they give are again like highly processed foods. And this is like looking at this part, I'm like, no wonder I just like relied on processed foods during that time. And then they have the acceptable junk food snacks and desserts. They do say later in this chapter, use your head, try to think in terms of fruits, veggies, whole grains, soy, and legumes for a well-balanced day of eating. That to me sounds more reasonable. They're recommending like whole plant foods. I think that's great. Then they give a whole month's worth of sample menus, breakfast, lunch, and dinner for every day. And the sample menus are pretty good in terms of being interesting and also having a lot of whole plant foods in them and not too much processed foods, which I think is great. Then in chapter 12, it's called FYI. Here's how it starts. Just because we wrote this book doesn't mean we're perfect. If you see us eating junk food or doing beer bongs, don't hold it against us. We believe in enjoying life and maintaining healthy balance. We're human. Also, we have some fat, gross body parts too. We're women. So fat means gross. So having a fat ass is gross. So like having curves is gross. Like, what are you talking about? They're basically being like, be really strict, be really hard on yourself. You don't want to be fat, do you? But like also we're all humans and like we eat like, you know, like crappy food sometimes too. That's fine. Then make that the thesis of the book. But like the book just has this like punishing language, and then you've got this part that's like, by the way, like we're humans, like we like make mistakes, we eat whatever we want. Okay, like we also have some fat, gross body parts too. Like way to give into like this like body dysmorphia kind of mindset, and like that bothered me. This whole chapter is just full of like little blurbs that I think maybe just like didn't fit anywhere else in the book. Yeah, this part kind of bothered me. Brushing your teeth is a great way to ward off sweet cravings and stop yourself from eating. But 2 or 3 times a day, every day for your entire life, you swallow trace amounts of toothpaste. What's in it? Chemicals, artificial sweeteners? Would you eat it? Read the ingredients, buy natural. So they use this part to talk about like having your toothpaste be natural. Okay, fine. But they started off by saying brushing your teeth is a great way to ward off sweet cravings and stop yourself from eating. That to me felt a little bit like eating disorder adjacent. Like, I don't think that it's part of like a healthy routine to like brush your teeth to stop yourself from eating. Like, if you're hungry, you should eat. Chapter 13 is called Use Your Head, and again, the first paragraph is a big ol' yikes. Don't be a fat pig anymore. You know what you have to do, now do it. But don't go anorexic on us either. It's easy to get caught up in any lifestyle change and go overboard. Make healthy choices and take excellent care of yourself without getting neurotic and obsessive. Hello, what do you think the language of most of this book was? Kind of neurotic and obsessive. Don't be a fat pig anymore, but don't go anorexic on us. Like, I don't like it. I reject it. Also, like, let's go a little easier on pigs. Pigs are great. Like, let's not use that as an insult in any way, shape, or form. And then it's also interesting, a few pages later, they make this confession, which I think we all kind of knew from the beginning. Now that you're a skinny bitch, don't turn into a skinny bitch. We conceived of the title Skinny Bitch to get attention and sell books. They're copying to it. That being said, I don't necessarily blame the authors for this sort of marketing strategy as much as I blame kind of like society as a whole at that point for like accepting that, and for that being the only way for a vegan book to sell is to make it like a very like fat shaming kind of like skinny aspirational book. I just think that's sad. I'm glad things have changed since then. There's still a long way to go, and you know, just wanted to address that. Then a few pages later, they say, your thoughts are just that powerful. So if you feel you are meant to be thin, and you believe Skinny Bitch will make you lose weight, and know that this book is going to change your life, you will be thin, you will lose weight, and your life will change. It's just that simple. Trust me, if anyone believed that this book was going to work in terms of making me lose weight, it was me. Just saying that, like, if you believe in it, it will happen. Like, no, it takes a little bit more than that, I would say. The last paragraph of this chapter is also just a whole big, I sincerely hope you will take the knowledge you've learned and put it to use from this moment on. You hold the power to change your life, and it's really so simple. Use your head, lose your ass. Who wants to lose their ass? I mean, that really shows the difference between that time and this time. That, if that doesn't date this book the most, I don't know what does. Then there's an afterword, and I have to say, I love this. It is from Old MacDonald's Factory Farm, which I guess is a book by C. David Coates. And it says, isn't man an amazing animal? He kills wildlife by the millions in order to protect his domestic animals and their feed. Then he kills domestic animals by the billions and eats them. This in turn kills man by the millions because eating all those animals leads to degenerative and fatal health conditions like heart disease, kidney disease, and cancer. So then man tortures and kills millions more animals to look for cures for these diseases. Elsewhere, millions of other human beings are being killed by hunger and malnutrition because food they could eat is being used to fatten domestic animals. Meanwhile, some people are dying of sad laughter at the absurdity of man, who kills so easily and so violently, and once a year sends out cards praying for peace on earth. That is probably the most poignant and beautiful part of the book, and it's from a different book. But no, I love that they included that. Then we get we have a section called recommended reading, and it's just like books, magazines, restaurant guides, cookbooks, websites, just resources to help you. Then they have the sources consulted section, and I did want to just touch on this really quickly. My mom and my brother, when they read the book, this was their biggest complaint with it, and unfortunately they sort of like didn't take anything in the book seriously because of this, that the sources consulted are not scientific studies. There is one scientific study referenced. Everything else were like books, articles. I think that it does unfortunately give a bit of a lack of credibility to the information they used because they were sourcing like an article, or like one source was like milksucks.org for like the dairy part, and it's like that's obviously going to seem biased, and I'm not saying that like none of these sources were credible, but I think it would have been great if they had like gone a step further and actually read the studies that those sources referenced, and then referenced the studies as opposed to like referencing an article and just like some random like website. They did have a lot of good information in here that is true and is backed up by science, but they for some reason just didn't go into those scientific studies as their sources. But wait, you thought the book was over? On the very last page of the book, you'd almost miss it. After the sources, after the endnotes, page 224. P.S. Wait, we have a confession to make. We really couldn't care less about being skinny. don't get scared or upset. You will definitely lose weight if you adopt the skinny bitch lifestyle. However, our real hope is for you to become healthy. We don't want anyone to be obsessed with getting skinny. When you eat right and exercise, you feel strong and healthy and confident. You start loving your body, not because you lose weight, but because you feel great. It's an inside job. You're finally treating your body like the temple it is. Too little, too late, bitches. Like, why couldn't that have been the intro of the book? Like, hey, wait, before you read the book, we know it's called Skinny Bitch. We really just want you to be healthy. Like, I couldn't believe it when I saw this in the back, like yesterday, when I was finishing the book, because I was like, wait a minute, that's what I was saying earlier. Like, they should say healthy instead of skinny, and like, they're saying that here. But you literally just wrote an entire 200+ page book about how you should want to be skinny, and how like being fat is disgusting, and like how like this diet will make you skinny. Like, it's really just too bad. And again, like I said before, I think it says more about society as a whole, you know, that the focus of this book was what it was, because you know what, they're right. They probably wouldn't have sold nearly as many copies. Not nearly as many people would have read the book if they, you know, had just been like, this is a book about veganism and animal rights. Like, people would be like, eh. I just want to go over my overall takeaways from the book. I'll start with negative so that I can end with positive. The negative, obviously, was the fat-phobic parts of the book, equating being skinny to being healthy, utilizing toxic diet culture and body standards to their benefit. Yeah, like I said, kind of sad, because they're basically admitting that they don't think they would have sold books without utilizing fat-phobic language. The lack of the scientific research and references, the stuff about fasting, did not like that. Yeah, and then my positive takeaways from this book. Obviously, this book changed my life for the better. It made veganism seem attainable to me and within reach for the first time ever. Like, before I read this book, I thought veganism as this like insane, intense, like way extreme thing that I could never imagine myself doing. And like, reading this book made me feel like I could do it. And even though it didn't last forever from reading the book, it gave me that foundation so that when, you know, a few years ago I decided to, you know, consider being vegan again, I knew I could do it because I had done it before, and I did it before because of this book. So I have to give credit and gratitude for that. Another positive thing is that pretty much all of the nutritional things that they talk about, the research and the science behind eating animal foods and eating plant foods, aligns with everything that I've learned since, and I was really pleasantly surprised to see that like I agreed with all of the stuff that they say about nutrition. It aligns with everything I just learned in my eCornell course, other than the fasting. And lastly, the fact that animal rights are at the core of this book is something that I love about this book. I'm grateful to them for emphasizing that so much. So yeah, I think this book changed a lot of people's lives. I am really curious if you guys read the book and if it affected you, like what your thoughts on it were, so let me know if you did read it. Yeah, this was fun for me and I hope you guys enjoyed it. My voice is like going, I've been talking for so long. But thank you so much for watching this video. Subscribe to my channel for more vegan and low-waste videos, and I'll see you again soon. Bye!